welcome to Optimal Game State. In today's video I want to talk about the recent release of the new edition of Warhammer Underworlds. Now, in a recent video I did talk about how the major change for this new edition was the removal of the Warband specific decks and how they've been replaced with just a Warband card. One hand here somewhere. So in that video I did conclude that that really wasn't a benefit for the players. That really it was a way for GW to kind of reduce costs, to separate themselves a little bit from the Chinese market where they would need to print paper. So by reducing the amount of card in a Warhammer Underworlds warband, they're able to kind of produce it a lot easier, move the production closer to Nottingham, whereas primarily the model and there's very little card. Okay, now in that video I did also talk about how the benefit for the players, and obviously the big benefit for the players is that GW should be able to keep things in stock, should be able to reissue warbands when they go out of stock. So we did actually see that in the previous edition, where when a warband for Warhammer Underworlds went out of stock, a little bit later it tended to turn up as an AOS specific release. So you would just get the models, you wouldn't actually get any of the cards along with it. Now, that change has some consequences. Largely the colour, the kind of feel of the warbands is maybe reduced a little bit, has the potential to just not be as interesting. Yeah, you know, the warbands are not as unique because they've got a specific card rather than a full deck. Now, as a Warcry fan myself, I don't really see too much of a problem with this because that's the way Warcry is designed. They have the warband card, and then you've got the individual fighters, and you know, I feel like there's enough uniqueness. But for existing players of Warhammer Underworlds, you need to help them. You need to convince them. You need to move them across from first edition to second edition, and that's why I've probably called this video something along the lines of maintaining customer confidence in Warhammer Underworlds, or some variety around that. And yeah, that title is probably a bit vague and hopefully non-controversial, because I do want to talk about how I feel GW have screwed up a bit with the release of the new edition, and also how they are going to get away with it. You know, I think largely this is a pretty common pattern for GW, that they will have missteps in release, that they will screw up rules, that we'll get very unbalanced new environments and new editions, and still they'll make a ton of money. Sales will go really well, and that largely is because there's a great appetite for their product. That isn't to say more money couldn't be made if they did things in a different way, and that's almost impossible to prove. I think it's like counterfactual thinking is what people refer to it as, because if I say GW could have done this and they would have made more money, I can't really say that. If GW did something different, something else would have happened, but there's no way for us to really know whether it would be beneficial or not. And that's kind of the rub of it. GW make money. I think if they had better business practices that maintained customer confidence, that they would make more money. But because they're still making good money out of what essentially I feel are bad business practices, they never learned this lesson. Okay. And yeah, and part of that is because the company is at the top of a niche market and they really have no competitors to compare against. So if you're a big toy company, for example, you'd be able to look at other toy companies and see what they're doing, what is working for them and what's not working for them. Games Workshop doesn't have that. They just see what they're doing, and typically, no matter what the decision, a manager within Games Workshop is going to say, I made this decision, we made money, therefore I made a good decision. Not realizing that that could have been a bad decision. They still made money, just not as much money as they could have, and then, you know, life goes on. Anyway, so the rest of this video, what we're going to try to do is we're going to look at what I think are some of the mistakes in the release, how they could have done it better, and ultimately why we are best off gaslighting ourselves, forgetting about all the bad things that GW have done and pretending like everything is hunky-dory just to make sure that we don't scare off new players, because a lot of these are kind of legacy issues and aren't directly problems that are going to relate to the long-term health of the game. Fingers crossed, hopefully. All right, let's get into the meat of it. So there are two aspects to this. So the first is how the game was released, and then the second is, I guess, around quality control. Yeah, quality control is probably the best term for it. So when we look at the second edition, obviously we need to look at it from two perspectives. So the first is from a new player. So for a new player, they look at the new box. Give me a second, I'll pull it out. They'll look at their new box. They'll get two cool warbands, and they're good to go. I think arguably the box is a little bit too expensive, but that's kind of a broad issue around GW. Personally, I feel if the price was a little bit lower, like they had for Shadespire when that first came out, that they would get more people buying, and overall they'd make more money. But the current approach is high markup. That's where the profits are. Fair enough. I'm not going to quibble about that particular point, but I think it is something that they should be looking at. So if a new player buys that box, they're good to go. It is actually a great box. There's 2 warbands. There's 4 decks. You can play each of the rival decks singly, so there's a big combination of games you can play through there. You'll probably find 1 or 2 are going to be better for each warbands. You can also use a Nemesis format where you take any of those 2 decks and make a new deck out of it, tailoring it. So I think there's lots of replayability even with just those 2 warbands. You can also buy another 2 decks, which will expand that range, which will just come out, and you can buy 2 new warbands. So that's a Gardeners, those Nurgle Gardeners, and the box of Lizardmen. So again, every time you add these new elements, it is multiplicative. So if you get a new warband, that's now 3 warbands where you only had 2. So it kind of it more than triples, I think, the number of combinations of the ways you can play. So that's great. So I think as a new player getting in, that is brilliant. Also, another option is to look at the 4 boxes. So there are 4 boxes for each of the Grand Alliances. Each of those boxes has a warband in it, and each of those warbands, there's 4 warbands in there. And you do get the cards for those. So I do think those are great purchases for new players. They're quite well priced, given that you're getting 4 warbands. I feel 4 is a lot for a new player. It kind of it is a massive acceleration. You're going from 2 to 6 immediately if you just get one of those extra boxes. They don't really get to pick out the ones that they want, but for new players, a purchase is going to be great. It's 4 extra ones. You're good to go. Moving on to the other side of things. So the market that I think that GW are missing the boat on here slightly are with the existing player base. So with the existing player base, you need to convince them that they should move over from 1st edition to 2nd edition. And to do that, they need to get all the rules for the minis. Now, the first thing that GW have done is this. So this is a pack of fighter cards and warband cards for 16. So it's the same for of each of the warbands from the Grand Alliances that you can buy the new models for. So for me, I have 7 of these, which means out of the 16, it's less than half. So let's say around half of the cards are going to be useful, and then the rest of the cards are not going to be useful. What I might try do is I might try get some of the warbands I'm missing, but I can't buy the new boxes. If I buy the new boxes, I'm going to get extra ones I don't need. So at the best case scenario for the Death one, I have the Crimson Court. I don't have the other 3. But now I've got the Crimson Court models and the Crimson Court cards and the cards for the other 3. So I just want the models for 1 or 2 of the other 3 maybe. Really I have to go look at eBay and see if I can find somebody spinning it, which isn't really great because that's GW kind of handing it off to a secondary market. And that secondary market for me is not going to exist. Within the UK, I think there is a great secondary market for people splitting boxes, selling off individual parts. It doesn't really exist anywhere else from what I can tell. Even though I'm in Ireland, which is next door, due to the whole Brexit shenanigans, if I try buy anything off the UK, like there's an extra 10 or 20 pounds thrown onto it due to VAT and a bunch of other things. Anyway, that is an aside. So I think if you're in the UK, you're going to buy this pack, you're going to see if you can get one or 2 of the warbands from the resellers. That'll probably work out quite well for you. But none of these warbands were part of a free PDF. So this is the other thing. There was a free PDF that went out, that GW issued on Warhammer Community for a bunch of warbands that don't have rules currently, or don't have these printed. But they chose not to put any of these 16 in that PDF. Why? The obvious reason is they felt that we would not buy this pack if those cards were in the PDF, which is so frustratingly dumb and narrow-minded. It's so silly. Within minutes of the embargo being lifted, we already had images of them circulated on the internet, ready to print if you wanted, because that's the community. That's how the community works. There literally was no reason not to put them in, because they were going to get, you know, screen grabbed from the reveals. People were going to be putting them in articles where they were talking about them. They should have just put them in the PDF. It would also, personally, I would have also found it nice to actually get rules for some of the other warbands printed. Sorry, the cards printed. And I think there really is a market for GW that they've currently neglected for print on demand. So card accessories are across all of the games that GW have. These card accessories tend to sell out straight away or just kind of linger. So the ones that are really interesting are just gone on release day and never get reprinted because they're doing them all over in China. And, you know, if they have to choose between getting new stuff printed or reprinting old stuff, they're probably going to be, you know, getting new stuff printed because they don't want to risk stuff, you know, only 50% of it selling or something like that. A print-on-demand model would service tons of that. Even if it was a case where, you know, you're paying a high overhead, you were having to wait 6 weeks or something to actually get the cards, at least they'd be there, at least they'd be available, and GW would be reaping profit for it. I don't think internally it should be a big shake-up. They'll need to invest in the sort of machines they'll need to get it, which will be a lot of money, and have staff ready to do it. But I mean, largely it probably is just going to be a room where, you know, they get the orders in, they print out the cards, they pack them, they send it off, and then someone who is keeping those PDFs or keeping those documents up to date with any of the changes. So when you know, a FAQ comes through that the next time the cards get issued, they include that as well. I think that would be something great for GW to do across all their lines. I think if you're a manager within GW, please investigate it and have a look at it, because I think there is money for you to make there, and that'll separate you from the difficulties of getting stuff over in from China, which I know seem to limit a lot of the production that GW have. Okay, so where am I? I kind of rambled around a little bit. So we've talked about the warband not being a PDF, and we've talked about print on demand. Okay, yeah. Then, yeah, I already rambled about the release of physical models and how frustrating it is for me. I do want to pick up the Grimwatch. But yeah, if I do so, I'll also get the Hesmon's Curse, the Crimson Court, and Canaan's Reapers, and that'll be a second Crimson Court for me. That whole bundling thing is a business practice that benefits GW. It means if Canaan's Reapers, for example, aren't particularly popular, they are going to be sitting on, GW are not going to be sitting on those models. It is actually going to be to the secondary market. So anyone who buys a box and tries to split them, they're going to be the ones that are stuck with these additional ones. GW are already going to reap profit from what they're selling, even if it is at a bit of a discount, and they don't have to worry about it as stock. It also reduces the number of SKUs, which I understand. However, the entire point of this big change, this big shake-up with the second edition was, in theory, the only benefit for players is if you are restocking these and putting these back on the table or back on the store every time they go out of stock. And if you're bundling them into fours, I don't really see the point there, you know? Unless it is just to the classic bundling that GW likes to do, just to, you know, release one brand new model and sell it with 20 models that you haven't been able to clear. Very, very frustrating. That's the kind of stuff that does reduce enthusiasm and, you know, cause people to eventually buy out of the whole GW ecosystem. Anyway, that's the whole release thing. So I think it's really good for new players. I think it's probably bad for existing players to a certain extent. I think if you're in the UK, you can, you know, get your card pack and then hit any of the others. Oh, so yeah, the other thing that I haven't mentioned is there are 29 warbands that didn't get unique war scrolls. And I think this kind of moves over to the kind of quality and the rather than production. So all of these warbands did get rules in the PDF, but for 29 of them, they get Grand Alliance war scrolls. So there are, each Grand Alliance has 2 war scrolls. So one example is with the Chosen Axes. The Chosen Axes are a dwarf warband in Order. Order has 2 war scrolls. One's Crusaders, the other's Protectors. So they get to pick from either of those. But by their very nature, these war scrolls are going to be super generic. They are not going to be flavorful. They're not going to be specific to these warbands. They are stopgap measures. They're vanilla. I quite like vanilla ice cream, but they're the vanilla idea. Now, GW have done this kind of thing before. Kill Team, the current edition, is a great example. Or sorry, the previous edition is a great example. After that came out, they released a book that had the index factions. So it was a compendium for Kill Team. And yeah, they've done this before with 40k, with their index release. The idea here is just churn out a bunch of bland, boring rules to tide people over. So these are why these are like this, I'm not entirely sure. There's potentially one of 2 reasons. One is that they're not really willing to put the extra investment into the design, so they're not willing to pay enough to free up a designer to actually get it done properly. So doing what they did 8 war scrolls for 29 warbands simplifies things, does it a lot easier. They just have to worry about the fighter cards. The fighter cards hopefully should have been just a minor switch over from first edition to second edition. Hopefully that was relatively straightforward to them. They try to keep the kind of same flavor but balance with the kind of new ethos. They really should have been doing 29 warbands for it, and the only reason they aren't, or they haven't, well, one of 2, is that they aren't willing to spend money. So that's a manager choosing to limit the amount of time that one of their staff has working on this project, or only having 1 staff member within limited time and not getting to 2 or 3 extra staff members that they could have paid. So one small department is losing a little bit of money, or is saving a little bit of money, and then these 29 warbands that many players might actually like and enjoy don't get proper rules and are basically non-existent. The idea was to give a convincing argument for players to move over from first edition to second edition. And for these 29 warbands, if these are warbands that you have, that you enjoy, don't. It really hasn't worked. These ones, yes. There are a couple of other warbands in there that do have rules that are specific to them, that are outside of this. They look good. I haven't gone through all of them. I don't know them all in detail. But the ones that are generic Grand Alliance ones seem to have been kind of half-assed and poor. Now, the other potential reason is arguably worse. And this is what they did with Kill Team. Basically, they do these boring vanilla ones so that the next release with the actual ideas will be more interesting and you will buy it. And GW have said that for these warbands, that further down the line, they may, not 100%, but they may give new cards, new war scroll cards and new fighters when they release them with the new rule, with the old models. That suggests that they don't think that these rules are good enough to actually sell the product, but that they are going to update them if they have product to sell. And that's really, really disappointing, because it's not about selling single warbands, it's about selling second edition. And unfortunately, we are looking at a number of players talking about sticking with first edition. Why would they move over if they've got a good chunk of these 29 warbands in their collection? They want to keep playing them. Why would they move over to second edition if they're just super boring, super vanilla ones, where there's no kind of character beyond the kind of basic fighters, which are, like, they don't have abilities on them, they just have the kind of raw stats. So yeah, that is very, very disappointing, and I think this is kind of one of the kind of big places where consumer confidence kind of gets hit. Now, the second one relates to balance, and again, this is something that we see GW do again and again and again. And I think this is what we can call the kind of minimal viable product. Getting something out that people can buy and people can play is enough. It shouldn't be, but kind of is enough. As long as people have what they need to play a game, even if it's a completely trash game, if it's a boring game, if the style of the game is terrible, whatever. I think that's how some of the managers look at it within the business. But that's not how they should be looking at it. Really, if Games Workshop wants to be like looking at kind of Star Wars, Disney level kind of idea, they should be taking more of a, I guess you'd call that an Apple approach, but let's not dwell too much on that. There's all sorts of problems with that. But they should be looking to make quality rules, quality products to play with their quality miniatures. You know, they don't make half-assed miniatures because they want to sell the best miniatures in the industry. That's the idea. Similarly, those games, it is Games Workshop. I know for a long time miniatures haven't been the focus, and games necessarily haven't been, but hopefully they've seen over the years that games are a crucial part of the entire ecosystem. When they half-ass a game, people will just buy the miniatures for a different game. So, you know, Warhammer Underworlds, I do feel, survived for quite a long time because people were playing Age of Sigmar with it, or more closer to home, were playing Warcry with it. But they could have made the whole thing better. And we were seeing a lot of small details here. Now, there's also other issues. So the World Championships recently came out for Warhammer Underworlds. The timing was a bit weird because it was just in time for the release of Emberguard, I think. But they needed to give players a little bit of time, so they knew what they were kind of coming into. So they were playing the new edition like almost before it came out, if that made sense. They did a really good job of this, I thought. My assumption is that the Emberguard got delayed a little bit, which is why it crossed over. But they gave all the players who qualified, I suspect they gave them a box, I'm not entirely sure, the option was there to buy them at least. They gave them all the rules, presumably PDF. They let them print out cards so they could play with proxies, and they put them all under NDA so that they wouldn't spoil it all. And that seems to have been very successful. People went out and played. Now, the big thing about that is 1/3, so I think it was like 36% of players actually picked the Gore Chosen of Drum, which suggests there might be a problem there. So, if I recall right, so let's assume there was just these 16 plus the 2 new, that's 18 in total. I think there were a few others as well that may have been legal for it, but I'm not entirely sure. But even if we're just looking at that level, if we're looking at just 18, Gore Chosen Drum took up like a full third. Like I think it was, as I said, I think it was close to 36%, but a good third. And then the Trifold Discord and the Headsman's Curse each were another 10. So 3 warbands took up 50% of the field. Playtesting is hard. Playtesting is really, really hard. And part of that is you playtest with your group of players, they give you feedback, you make the changes, and then all that needs to be playtested again. And you could do it forever, but at some point you got to stop. Now, what may have happened here was the Gore Chosen had some feedback given to them, changes were made, but then they didn't get a chance to playtest that and just had to go out as is. These things happen. It is true, these things happen, but it is a consistent thing with Games Workshop that it really feels like their playtesting is not up to par. Whether this is just they're not putting enough time in, they're not engaging with enough people, they're not spending the money on having staff who know what they're doing, kind of work through it. I don't quite know. But again, this is something that really shakes the consumer confidence in a product. Now, what we're probably going to see is we're going to see a errata in like a month or two, and we'll see some tweaks. The new system should make adjusting things relatively easy, because you just need to worry about the main card and then the fighter cards for the warband. So Gore Chosen and Drum they'll be able to focus it in, whereas previously they would have had to look at an entire deck and see if there are elements of the deck that are causing problems. They are also going to have a look at I think so they had 6, I think all 6 decks were legal. So the 4 that come in the Emberguard box and then the 2 new ones that was coming out. They may have to look at some of those cards and see it, but it is not a great experience to buy in and then in a few months' time, see a bunch of errata, which means that your cards don't work the way they were, your fighter isn't as good as he was before, and stuff like that. That's always a feel bad. It's also a real feel bad if you turn up at a local tournament, a local event, playing some casual games, and you're just getting crushed by other warbands. So if you turn up with something what you think is fun, and then someone else brings out the Gore Chosen and just stomp you, that's a real bad feeling. And then, you know, you might not turn up to that again, and because of that, you might buy out, just, you know, stop getting involved in both Warhammer Underworlds and then largely the Games Workshop environment. So that is a non-tangible impact for something like playtesting that I don't think necessarily Games Workshop acknowledge or understand. That if you're saving, you know, a couple of $100,000 on not having an employee working on a product, so you just get the minimum viable product rather than a good quality game, there is an impact. There is a loss that will happen to Games Workshop as a whole, to the brand as a whole, and, you know, that kind of stuff stretches on. But it is non-tangible. Whereas if you don't pay that employee, you could just take their salary off and say, I made savings for the company, which unfortunately, due to the nature of, you know, counterfactual thinking, you can't really argue with, because you have to go into hypotheticals. But that's where we're at. So what, as a fan, as a player of this, what should you do? Well, realistically, if you're like me and you've got some warbands, this is probably good. There are a couple of other warbands that are in the PDF that you might look at getting some printed out. I would avoid all the Grand Alliance ones, unfortunately. I have a few myself. We're going to see how it works going forward. But this is a great board game. This is something that you can put together and you can have and you can break out and play with someone. GW will either get it working at a competitive level or they won't. Either way, it's a good time that you can have with your friends playing the game. So, you know, never neglect that, never forget that. The models are also gorgeous. I do have my my Stormcast painted, and I've started working on my Skaven. They are great models. They will work for Warcry eventually. We don't have rules for them. But, you know, they are useful across multiple games, so it's not just Warhammer Underworlds. So yeah, I'm still really hopeful for it. As I said at the start, I am going to gaslight myself, and I'm going to forget about the issues and the problems. I'm just not going to worry about those warbands that I don't feel I can play anymore. I'm going to focus on the ones that I do have the rules for. I'm going to paint up the ones that I have the models for. I've got about 4 in here that I haven't finished painting, so I'll paint up those, and hopefully that'll be enough of an environment. If I find a warband, so if I find something that kind of causes problems like the Gore Chosen Drum, I'll take them out of my rotation. So when I'm playing casual games with friends, I just won't play Gore Chosen Drum. Then if you want to go and get more competitive, you know, you can look at the stats, you can see which ones are at the top tier. If that's something you're going to enjoy, you know, good for you. And yeah, we're going to see errata, we're going to see changes. You don't have to do them in your home games. You can completely ignore all that. For some people, this constant cycle of updates and updates and updates every month, every 3 months, whatever it is, having more changes, you know, when you only play like a game once every 2 weeks or something like that, you can actually ignore it. You don't have to stick to it unless, you know, maybe you're going to a store and you're playing a variety of different people. If it's just you and a friend, or if it's you and kind of a few people in the store, honestly, you can kind of ignore these things as long as you're all on the same board. Alright, so yeah. Overall, I think some players are going to stick with first edition, and I don't think they're necessarily wrong with that. If you have a extensive first edition set, I probably would hold on to those cards if that's the game that you enjoy playing, especially if there are some of the warbands that have fallen into that Grand Alliance selection. You might have a better game to play if you play it with the first edition rather than moving on to the second edition. Now, I didn't talk about a lot of the fantastic changes that they have had in second edition. So, you know, minor things like the crits no longer dominating things. There was lots of like small little things, and actually I quite like the new board as well. Maybe, you know, those are the kind of things that you would like to incorporate into the new version. I'm not necessarily true. Is there room for a 1.5? Maybe not, but yeah, I think of this as a self-enclosed board game rather than as what it used to be, which was the full competitive game, and then just like see if you can have fun. and enjoy it. So that's the big thing. As I said, maybe this video is targeted at one particular manager or like a few managers within Games Workshop. I think you guys are making mistakes. I think you guys are leaving money on the ground, and there are great opportunities for you to just have higher quality rules, better play testing, and like the models are already fantastic. You can't really improve on the models, but actually improving on the game is a place that GW can invest, can make gains in. And as I said, that print on demand model would solve a lot of issues that you have around the production of decks and SKUs getting stuck on shelves and stuff like that. Right, this has been a big rant. I'm delighted to have finally gotten this out of the way because this has been weighing on me for a bit. Hopefully it wasn't too ranty. Please post anything that you think in relation to the whole thing. If you feel like I've got something wrong, if I'm off base, in the comments. And yeah, I'll get back to doing something a little bit more constructive and a little bit more informative in the next few days. So keep an eye out for that. Right, have a great week, everyone.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Each week I put up a new video talking about one of Games Workshop's specialist games. The goal is always to try and make the best possible two-player experience. If this is something you'd find interesting, please subscribe to the channel and comment to let me know what you'd like to see in future.